also thank very warmly the BCL and TSC for putting together this conference, which has been great so far. So we'll try to keep the level. I guess we are taking the discussion where the previous panelists left it. So now we know everything about how the international monetary system works and how it evolves over time. And the question we want to dig deeper in is, is there anything new with cryptocurrencies and in particular with stablecoins, quote-unquote stablecoins, coming? And that's really the question I would like to try and answer. But maybe before I do that, I think it's useful to take a step back, and Gita and Hélène did it already. Over the past 50 years, the US dollar has defied all attempts of other currencies to throw it off its throne, to throw it off the Iron Throne. For those of you who followed the story around the Iron Throne, there have been many attempts to sit on it, and eventually, who eventually get there can be quite surprising. So that could be the story of the international monetary system looking forward. But let me come back to the serious discussion. And so when you look at the recent history of the international monetary system, it looks a little bit like a Groundhog Day. In the 1980s, the story was about the yen displacing the dollar because Japan was then gaining international status, becoming an international creditor, and that didn't happen. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, the story was about the euro displacing the dollar, and it also didn't happen, as we've seen on the screens. And more recently, the story was about the renminbi displacing the dollar, and it still hasn't happened. So I think from an analytical standpoint, the really important question to move one step further is whether anything has changed. So is there anything different with cryptocurrencies and stablecoins? And that's clearly a very speculative discussion, because we're assuming here that all these projects will pass the regulatory test. And as was mentioned by Jean and by Governor Reinesch, there is an international discussion on how to address stablecoins. That started as a G7 working group, which started in Chantilly in July, and will deliver policy recommendations ahead of the annual meetings in Washington, D.C., so very shortly. And then there is also a financial stability board group discussing the regulatory implications of stablecoins, and it starts as a regulatory discussion on issues we are not discussing today, such as compliance with anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism standards, investor protection, stability and safety as payment systems, etc., etc. And I think the mindset in the regulatory community is it's only when we are reassured that they can tick all boxes and pass the bar, and the bar is set pretty high, that we can have the kind of macro discussions that we are having tonight. So I'm just saying here that it remains a remote discussion, because we're really focusing on the regulatory aspects. And economists, I guess, would like to see it as some kind of a trade-off between safety and convenience. And there are clear convenience gains coming with stablecoins. It's cheaper, it's faster, it might be better for financial inclusion, etc. But we regulators don't see the trade-off. So we want it to be safe, full stop. And then we'll discuss the convenience. So just wanted to start with that. But now let us discuss the convenience and the impact on the international monetary system. And so what I would like to suggest here is that this time may be different. And so there may be features of cryptocurrencies, and in particular of stablecoins, that can make it different from what we've seen so far. That is a kind of very strong path dependency, very strong complementarities, which have been dissected by Gita and then by Hélène, which creates very strong path dependency and inertia in the international monetary system. That's what we've seen so far. And things could become different. That's what I would like to suggest, to throw and to start a discussion. And that's about the speed of transition, and that's also about the drivers for transition. And so these are two simple points, right? And there is a much more extended version on the ECB website if you're interested. So I just make the argument short, and you'll find the numbers and the details on the ECB website. So first, the speed. Starting point, as we said, is that so far we've seen a lot of inertia. But as was, I think, very aptly and importantly reminded to us by Gita, any international currency started as a means of payment, and it started as a wholesale means of payment. That is, it is being used by merchants. That's how the sterling started, right? As a currency being used by merchants. And that's how all international currencies have started. They start on the wholesale side. But we're seeing now the discussion moving to the retail side, that is to the customer. And it might be that international money adoption, currency adoption, looking forward, will be driven less by companies and merchants and more by consumers directly. And that's a different discussion. And that might change the way we look at it. If you look at the way consumer habits have changed recently over the last, say, decade, the number of internet users has doubled over the last 15 years, also the number of mobile phone users. Global remittances have increased by over 50% globally. Cross-border e-commerce activity has trebled. So you see consumer demand for global payment services, and that is new. And it's only natural that new payment solutions, such as stablecoins, are mainly targeting consumers and workers directly. They're not targeting merchants. And these solutions have been adopted much more quickly than in the past. If you take Kenya, for instance, which we all see as an example for us. I mean, I always say that the aim for developed economies is to catch up with Kenya when it comes to payments. The volume of mobile money transactions in Kenya has trebled in less than 7 years. And today accounts for half of the Kenyan GDP. So we're far away from that in our economies. And you see the same kind of development in China. So the point I'm making here is that with adoption moving from the wholesale side to the retail side, you could see also the speed of adoption changing. And so you could see the speed of transition from one equilibrium to another equilibrium in the international monetary system being much faster. So it remains a multiple equilibrium story, clearly, but the speed of transition could be faster. That's the first point. And the second point is that the drivers of the transition might also change. Some drivers of currency adoption will not change. Currencies have to be stable to be trusted. I guess that was a point made by, I guess, by Friedrich Hayek, I mean, long ago, when he advocated for international currency competition. He said, let's give a chance to the currencies that will prove the most stable, because that's the one that will be used. And there is truth to that. Currencies being well managed, currencies providing stability will remain an important driver, which is also why the discussion changes when it moves from cryptocurrencies to stablecoins, because there is this promise of stability. So whether this promise will be delivered on, I don't know. That's part of the discussion we're having with these projects. But clearly there is a promise of stability that can make it more likely that this would be widely adopted. If you compare, say, Libra and Bitcoin, I mean, there is a clear difference, if it works. But some factors could be new. We mentioned convenience, the cost being lower, the speed being higher in executing payments. But one important novelty here is the existence of underlying networks. And it might be easier to connect a new currency to an existing network, which is basically what the Libra project is about, than to build a network on an existing currency, which is the kind of process that we had in mind when we were discussing international currencies so far. And so you could see the kind of causality, the kind of sequencing that was described by Gita. You could see it being put on its head, because this is driven by consumers and because it's not about building networks around a currency, it's about building a currency on an existing network. And that could make the dynamics quite different, also from a theoretical standpoint. And a second driver, but which is, in my view, more ambiguous, relates to privacy. I think there is a consensus, unanimity in the regulatory community that any stablecoin should conform to international anti-money laundering and KYC and anti-terrorism regulations. That's obvious, and that's, in a sense, the first box that we want to be ticked. And that would be the same for everyone. But stablecoins could differentiate according to how much personal data they collect and they process, and according to the way they use the personal data. And here we see huge differences in preferences globally. I mean, privacy regulations vastly differ globally. In Europe, we have GDPR, which provides a lot of protection to users. We don't see that in some other parts of the world. So that can be a different driver of currency adoption, which can also create fragmentation because the underlying preferences and the underlying regulation will be different. So to conclude, and building on that kind of new dynamics, I can see three possible scenarios. The first scenario is about simply preserving the status quo. And that would be the case in particular if the conclusion of the regulatory discussion is that we are so worried about consumer protection, investor protection, etc., that we just don't let these projects lift off the ground, which is not what I wish, but it's a possible conclusion of that discussion. And then, of course, these currencies, by definition, will never will not challenge the international monetary system. That does not imply a digital standstill, and there is now broad understanding across the official community globally that with whatever happens to Libra and other projects, we have to use it as this was a useful wake-up call, and we have to use it as an opportunity to improve on our existing payment systems in particular. And Philippe mentioned TIPS, which for us in Europe would be really the basis for that discussion. The second scenario is central bank digital currencies. So Mark Carney in Jackson Hole floated the idea of having a synthetic hegemonic currency, SHC, the synthetic hegemonic currency, that would be provided through a network of central bank digital currencies. So here, of course, you have two sides, and you need to disentangle the two parts of the discussion. You have one discussion on having a global currency, and the previous panel had a little bit of a discussion on the SDR, so it's not a new discussion. I'm not going to come back to it. That has little to do with technology everything to do with the appetite for global cooperation on economic policies, which has been low since the end of Bretton Woods, and some would argue is even lower today. So the global aspect is one thing, but then you can have a network of central bank digital currencies. We are all working on it at different paces. And there is a case for central banks globally to join their forces and jointly investigate the feasibility of central bank digital currency, preferably based on shared technical standards. So that with or without Libra, in a sense. And the third scenario is what Markus Brunner-Meyer and Harold James and Jean-Pierre Landau have called digital currency areas. That is a more kind of jaded, more complex landscape where policymakers would successfully coordinate, possibly across a number of jurisdictions, to conclude that stablecoins can happen because the regulatory prerequisites will be met. But that doesn't have to be global, it can be regional. And in a sense, since it requires a prior degree of legal coordination and even political coordination to agree on conditions being met, I would probably suggest that any digital currency area will also be a regional currency area. And Europe, of course, might be the place where this happens because we have a common regulatory approach by construction. So that would entail some fragmentation of the international monetary system, but it's already fragmented after all. And the transition towards it would still pose challenges to public policy. Currency substitution has been mentioned by Gita, and it's an important concern when it comes to the transition to stablecoins, global or regional. Stablecoinization, sorry for that awful word. Stablecoinization in an economy would likely start in economies with high inflation and weak institutions, low credibility in monetary policy, and can be a clear challenge to monetary policy autonomy. And global stablecoins could also increase capital flow volatility. They could have an effect on exchange rate and financial conditions, and then on inflation outcomes, which we certainly have to understand better. And at a higher level, what I've called stablecoinization, that is substitution from the local currency into stablecoins, would potentially relegate key policies that belong to the public sphere to private payment providers, to private institutions, well, big tech in particular, which is an outcome which citizens clearly cannot accept. So I end with that, and the conclusion, I guess, in one sentence, the one-sentence conclusion for us central bankers is that you can conceive a future where we would have to work harder on central bank digital currencies. You can conceive a future where we would have to work harder on improving, upgrading payment systems to answer the question that stablecoins have been asking in the first place, that is convenience of payment systems. And you can conceive a future where we would have to work harder on the regulatory environment that makes it possible in a safe way, and I guess it's going to be a little bit of the three.